Welcome everybody to the third instalment in the ISCAST New Zealand Christians in Science conversations on creation care in the climate change century. I'm Sarah Wilson, I'm the Program Director for ISCAST, and I'm coordinating these conversations with Nicola Hoggard-Cregan, who is the Co-Director of New Zealand Christians in Science, and Chris Mulheron, the Executive Director of ISCAST. Tonight, we are blessed to have two speakers with us, and for that reason, the presentation part of the evening will be extended from 30 to 40 minutes, followed by 20 minutes of Q&A. So just before I introduce them, I'd just like to open in prayer. Dear God, Creator of the universe, we pray in a spirit of thanksgiving and praise. You were there at the beginning of all things, shaping our world and preparing us for it. We know that you made this universe and all that is in it, the oceans, the forest, stars, the soil, and we are blessed to see your handiwork throughout the universe and even in the smallest of creatures. We pray that you would uphold Mick and Claire as they share with us, keep their minds clear and focused, and help us to look inward, reflect, and urge us to take action as we learn how to be good stewards of your creation as you intended us to be from the beginning. So there's a very good reason why we have two speakers with us tonight. Mick Pope and Claire Harvey co-authored a book titled A Climate of Hope, Church and Mission in a Warming World. Our first speaker, Mick Pope, has a PhD in meteorology from Monash University, and he lectures in meteorology. He's also a Professor of Environmental Theology at Missional University and is an adjunct lecturer at Eastern College. Claire Harvey is a mother to Sarah and Micah, and she's involved in the village church in Mount Eliza, Victoria. Prior to retraining as a careers advisor, Claire worked as a carbon accountant. She also serves on the Ethos board, and in 2020, she was elected to Frankston City Council. She recently advocated successfully for a doubling of tree planting in her local area over the next 4 years. Now, I'd like to welcome Mick first, because he'll be talking now on In the Beginning, Climate Change, Human Mastery, and Genesis 1. Thanks, Mick.
Thank you very much. What I'm going to present tonight is based in part upon my master's thesis. I actually get to graduate from face-to-face next Friday. So climate change, the way in which we approach or way in which we frame the problem will shape the approach that you take and the answers that you extract. So in circles such as ISCAST, oftentimes it'll be taken as a technological problem. And so we'll be looking for technological fixes, whether or not it's nuclear or no nuclear, whether we look at geoengineering solutions to mop up the problem, etc. If we were a group of economists, we might talk about carbon dioxide as an externality to the market and how we include that through pricing. If we approach it as an ethical problem, we might start talking about diet and consumption and all these sorts of things. And oftentimes that's an argument that can degrade into finger pointing. And I know one person, for example, who says the only Christian response is to give up your job, earning money through the secular economy and chain yourself to things. So there's broad extremes in that. Or indeed, we could take it as a theological problem, which is essentially what I've done in my master's, is to look at Genesis and Leviticus also and think about posing some theological questions. It's worth keeping in mind that when we talk about climate change, we really are talking about not a minor perturbation to the Earth system, but in fact, leaving one particular geological period and into another. So here we have a plot of temperature reconstructed from ice cores, etc., over the past 20,000 years, the last glacial maximum during the Pleistocene, which was an age which was cold and arid with low sea level, and the period of the rise of Homo as a genus, and then the past 10 or 11,000 years thereabouts of the Holocene, the recent period, which saw the rise of agricultural civilization, axial religions, writing, etc. Everything that we take for granted appeared during that period. And you can see that the climate variability during that period is only about plus or minus 0.5 of a degree. This is an older figure, so you can see that this 1.5 degrees Celsius lower band is certainly something that we're likely to, well, almost certainly going to exceed. And there are some businesses who have planned on what a 4 degrees Celsius world might look like for their business, or factored it into their growth model. So that's quite insane. So we need to talk about something known as the Anthropocene as a new geological period where humans are the dominant geological force. Paul Crutzen received a Nobel Prize for his work on stratospheric chemistry and ozone depletion. And that's a quote from a paper from Nature. Because of these anthropogenic emissions of carbon dioxide, the global climate may depart significantly, as we've just seen, from natural behaviour for many millennia to come. It seems appropriate to assign the term Anthropocene to the present, in many ways, human-dominated geological epoch. Of course, that's a contentious suggestion. Normally, when you classify geological age, you're doing it well after it's occurred, but we're living in the middle of it. And others have defined what we call planetary boundaries, which is a safe operating space for humanity. So it's an anthropocentric definition that includes climate change and the concomitant ocean acidification, but is also more inclusive of the ways in which we disturb other parts of the Earth system, including the overuse of fertilizers, disrupting biogeochemical flows, our domination of freshwater use and land system changes, biosphere integrity, in other words, ecocide, or the sixth mass extinction, novel entities. So if you've had a drink today, it's quite possible you've consumed some microplastics, and of course, things like ozone depletion that we've talked about before. So it's important to, as significant as climate change is, to put it in its entire context, that the Anthropocene claims that humanity as a whole has had a large impact upon the planet. But again, that's somewhat question begging, because we need to ask, when do you start this geological period? And from a scientific point of view, it's likely 1964, and it's marked by carbon-14 associated with the nuclear testing. And certainly that period is marked by something known as the Great Acceleration and the period of consumer capitalism. We don't have time to dwell upon this figure taken from the work by Lewis and Maslin, the book there, and their Nature paper, but almost certainly the ideological beginnings lie in the European expansion in the 1500s and onwards, and the rise of mercantile capitalism. So it's probably more accurate to describe the current period as the Capitalocene. Jason Moore has done a lot of work into this, and he notes that prior to 1450, ecological changes took hundreds to thousands of years. To be certain, it's quite likely that the origins of agriculture have modified the climate and played a role in the stability of the Holocene. Nonetheless, the changes were small. The age of capital between 1450 to 1750 is defined by new technologies, which we might argue are neutral in themselves, but an attitude that's not neutral. So cheap nature as a resource and cheap labor. In particular, this is the period where the Americas were colonized, seeing a 10,000-fold increase in slaves to the Americas during the period shown, over 400 million square kilometers conquered, and anything, well, the figures speak for themselves. 54 to 61 million people in the Americas pre-colonization, and by 1650, a mere 6 million, all capitulated to war, slavery, and European diseases, producing a measurable increase. That's not meant to be a dip, that's an increase. Sorry, no, it is a dip in carbon dioxide because agriculture collapsed and forests took over. So what is the Anthropocene challenge for us? Well, firstly, it's the idea of human mastery. It's the idea that we believe that knowledge is power and that we can control the world, but the world has fought back the perturbations that we've introduced to the Earth system. So we move from God's two books and what we might learn from the non-human creation to a desire to control and manipulate it. A second issue, and we won't be able to touch upon this tonight, is the telos, or the purpose of history. People like Adam Frank say that the Anthropocene is a necessary step that we must go through as a civilization towards our goal of capturing the entire planet as an energy source. But we need to question that, this secular eschatology of progress. And thirdly, there's the whole concept of anthropocentrism, that is Gaia by its back. The earth is an actor and not simply a stage. And this is essentially a form of dualism that has both secular and religious underpinnings. Dipesh Chakrabarty points out the fact that geological history is a narrative of many dispersed and networked actors, none acting with a sense of internal autonomy with which humanist historians have used the word agency. In other words, the Earth system progresses unthinkingly in a way, but there is agency in a more general sense amongst all its parts, be they biotic or abiotic. Ewa Binchik points out that human beings have a form of hyperagency, that is the ability to change the climate while enmeshed in the process of planetary metabolism. That is, we're a part of the Earth system, but it's turned against us as the uncontrollable other. And this clash of human and geological history challenges our ontic certainty. In other words, things progress as they've always been. Well, unfortunately, they're not now. So very, very briefly, then some theological questions when you turn to the Hebrew Bible is, what was Israel's responsibility for the land? And how is this shaped by this understanding of divine sovereignty and the nature of the land itself? And how might that inform our own responsibility as religious communities that accept these texts as scripture? The three answers, if I don't get through everything that I have, essentially that Genesis 1 represents the creation of sacred time in the form of the Sabbath, which we are to follow, the creation of sacred space, that is the creation as a protological temple, and we see that in Revelation as an eschatological one as well. And that thirdly, creation as a partner in all of this and not simply a pawn to manipulate endlessly. I probably don't need to stress in this kind of audience that the need to read Genesis 1 in a non-literalistic fashion, but it's worth pointing out that it follows what we might call a functional ontology, which is simply to contrast, say, what you might consider when you build a house and think about the materials with which you might build that house, and then with a home and which room is the master bedroom and how you design the kitchen and what soft furnishings you use and the relationships in the form and function that operate internally. That's an analogy due to Old Testament scholar John Walton. So, for example, the formless and void that we read about in Genesis 1:2, over which the Spirit of God floats or hovers, those two words in the Hebrew are used again in Isaiah 34 to refer to the ruin of Edom and the collapse of agriculture. So Genesis 1 is about small d design, but it's about the relationship of the creation to human and non-human needs, in particular, the creation of food on day 3. Another example is the sun, moon, and stars that are mentioned in Genesis 1:14 for the marking of the seasons, the Moedim in the Hebrew. But in Leviticus 23, this refers to the Moed de Yahweh, refers to the 7 agricultural festivals of Israelite society, which are also tied to salvation history events. So they're kind of mnemonics for remembering what God has done. Which points then to the idea of the subduing the earth as must be intimately linked to agriculture. But perhaps more importantly is the centrality of Sabbath. And there's a note there that it's most likely, and hopefully this doesn't offend some, that an earlier creation account of the priestly school of Israel was further adapted by what's referred to as the Holiness School, responsible for the second half of Leviticus, with a particular emphasis on Sabbath keeping. So you have, for example, 8 creative acts grouped into 6 days, somewhat awkwardly, and the splitting of the sun, moon, and stars with the creation of light and day on day 1. But of course, that's entirely necessary if you're going to mark out days, to have light and day created initially, or rather light created and a pre-existing darkness, so that you have a ability to mark the pattern of the day. So it's not an awkward concordism that says light and dark were created. We couldn't see the sun, moon, and stars because of an opaque atmosphere, that kind of thing. And nor is the primary intent of Genesis 1:1 to defend the doctrine of creation ex nihilo, but to mark out the Sabbath. The text is replete with heptads, that is groups of 7, which is why I've got Genesis 1:1 to 2:3 in the English translations. The headings do us no favors, of God and day. And in day 1, for example, light, the word light and the word day used to add up to 7 times. So that pattern's very clear in the text. But then there's also the awkwardness of the 7th day, which kind of points towards this being a later addition. And here's the text of verses 31 of chapter 1 and onwards. And you can see that God saw that he had everything that he had made, and indeed it was very good. And there was evening and there was morning the sixth day. Thus the heavens and the earth were finished, kala in the Hebrew, with all their multitude. But then that's somewhat contradicted in verse 2, where it says, on the seventh day God finished kala, the work that he had done, and rested on the seventh day from all the work that he had done. So God blessed the seventh day and hallowed it. So seventh day is used 3 times to bang us about the heads to say that this is the end of creation. And it's worth pointing out that if the original text is crafted in a Babylonian context where the Israelites were in some kind of bonded labor, then the emphasis on Sabbath rest makes a lot of sense. Note also there's no command to keep the Sabbath here, but there's the declaration that it's a holy time. So it points forward to the later Sabbath legislation. But there's also the hint that because it's God rested from all the work that he had done in creation, that Sabbath rest is open to all creation. And you can see where that might become a principle for combating climate change and the broader issues of creation care. But finally, the famous text of Genesis 1:26 to 28 about dominion and being made an image and so on, this points to the full stop on this creation text is not human mastery, but the limits of human mastery and the resting in what God has done. Sabbath is the key to Genesis 1, not human significance or uniqueness or divine control over the creation per se, apart from what God has done. So it's a point to rest, but also divine sovereignty. I'll talk more about this in a second. The other key point is that this is creation of sacred space, and to unpack this fully would take longer than I have, but there are strong parallels between Genesis 1 and the Enuma Elish, which is a creation account of the ancient Babylonians, where the deep, the waters that we read about in Genesis 1, the word is, in the Hebrew is tehom, is cognate with Tiamat, the chaos monster. And in case you were going to miss the subtle hint that the writer talks about the children of Tiamat, the Tananim, the sea monsters on day 5, which is obscured in some English translations. And so it's the idea that even though this is an account of the control and the ordering of chaos, chaos continues to lurk in God's good creation. And you see that in Genesis 3:1, the serpent. So chaos is brought under control in these creative acts over 6 days and a rest on the 7th. And again, there's another hint, the division of the waters above from the waters below, the creation of space, matches Tiamat's corpse. So Tiamat was slayed by Marduk, the storm god, in the Enuma Elish, and creation made out of her corpse. And so it's worth pointing out that while some might be concerned that there's a loss of a feminine aspect of creation here, the mythologized account says that creation is not a violent act of femicide. Likewise, in the Enuma Elish, human beings are created out of the blood of the armies of Tiamat, and human beings are created not for dominion, but to serve lazy gods. So again, it fits in nicely with this Sabbath theme that actually creation is, to a large extent for human benefit. We're not created to be simple slaves. But at the end of the Enuma Elish, the other gods build Marduk a temple to dwell in. And so the parallels must continue. And of course, in place of that, in Genesis 1, human beings are created in the image or the icon of God. So we're placed, and again, it's kind of sotovoce and it's protological that human beings are placed in this temple at its creation. And of course, you see this completion formula, the Kala, again in Exodus 39 and 40, which focuses God's presence in the temple, or in the tabernacle firstly, and then in the Jerusalem temple. But in the whole sweep of scripture, of course, Revelation broadens that out again. There's no temple in the New Jerusalem. What this does say, if we put the two themes together, is that Sabbath keeping is intimately tied up with the control of chaos. That is to say, if Genesis 1 is about God's ordering of good creation, and particularly that we can feed ourselves, that we can engage in agriculture, and the non-human creation can enjoy its existence and be fruitful and multiply itself, along with human beings, then Sabbath keeping seems to be tied into this creation temple and the maintaining of order against chaos. which is something we see undone in the priestly flood, when the waters of the deep, the fountains of Tehom, are released again. Again, hopefully you can see how this might connect to themes of climate change. So by the time we make Leviticus, where we're picking up the commandments to do certain things that are illustrated or given their theological underpinnings in Genesis 1, you see what's referred to as H, the Holiness Code from Leviticus 19:1 onwards, the command that you shall be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy. And how is holiness manifest? By each of you shall revere his father and his mother and his father, and keep my Sabbaths. I am Yahweh your God. There's a pairing then in particular of the phrase in the start of this Holiness Code in Leviticus 19:30 and 26:2, you shall keep my Sabbaths and reverence my sanctuary. I am the Lord, or I am Yahweh. So Sabbath and temple are linked intimately in the Hebrew mind, which are ultimately tied up with the covenant. And we'll come back to this covenant theme in a few minutes' time, but it is a sign forever between me and the people of Israel that in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, and on the seventh day he rested and was refreshed. And you see in the end of Leviticus the implications if the Hebrews did not keep the Sabbath and did not reverence the temple, that included ecological impacts as well as ultimately exile. And I'll touch upon those in a minute. So we've talked about the creation of sacred time and the need for rest. And we've talked about the creation of sacred space and the potential that creation itself can be viewed as a temple and therefore holy in some way. A theme that's picked up further in Leviticus in the way in which it picks up on Genesis 2 and 3, which we have no time to touch upon. But the third thing is that we need to learn to see through the Hebrew eyes that creation is a partner, that is even kin, and it opens up all sorts of post-colonial and indigenous readings. But there in the Hebrew text, we see, then God said, let the earth put forth vegetation, plants yielding seeds, and fruit, trees of every kind on earth that bears fruit with the seed in it. And it was so. The earth brought forth vegetation, plants yielding seeds of every kind, and trees of every kind bearing fruit with the seed in it. And God saw that it was good. And the same thing comes for the living creatures of every kind, domestic, that is cattle, creeping things, and the wild animals of the earth of every kind. God commands the earth to bring it forth, and it is so. So the earth, the eretz in Hebrew, and it's worth noting that eretz is also translated as land in Leviticus and other places, is an active partner. Now, at this point, you might say, well, that's simply symbolism, or it's an analogy or a figure of speech or whatnot. I'm struggling for the right word to use. But the Hebrew text goes further. Creation, it seems, to have a vocation. And this is particularly significant in Leviticus compared to, say, Deuteronomy, where it's recognized that the land is Yahweh's and that the people of Israel are mere sojourners rather than its permanent owners, in exactly the same way that the nations before them were cast out. And so you read in Leviticus 18, do not defile yourselves in any of these ways, for by all these practices, the nations I am casting out before you have defiled themselves. Thus the land became defiled, and I punished it for its iniquity. And the land vomited out its inhabitants. A lovely little word picture there, a vomit. And then a warning to the Israelites, otherwise the land will vomit you out for defiling it as it vomited out the nation that was before you. So the people beforehand defiled the land, defiled themselves. Therefore, the land was defiled, and God punished the land and vomited out the inhabitants. Is this still a word picture, or is there something deeper going on? Creation also in the Holiness Code has rights. And in chapter 26, it's the equivalent of the blessings and curses at the end of Deuteronomy. And it talks about the temporary exile of the people from the land of Israel. And we read, then the land shall enjoy its Sabbath years as long as it lies desolate. And in the word enjoy, which is used several times in this passage, is the same word one would use for a human being enjoying something. The land shall enjoy its Sabbath years as long as it lies desolate, while you are in the land of your enemies. Then the land shall rest and enjoy its Sabbath years. As long as it lies desolate, it shall have the rest it did not have on your Sabbaths when you were living in it. So it's the idea then that the land of Israel was perfectly entitled to a rest from labor, and it's the same period of time with which the manumission of slaves occurred, and there was economic reset, and the land, of course, was a fundamental part of the economy for the inhabitants. But we read here very clearly that land was, in a sense, meant to enjoy its own rest from human laboring, which didn't mean that it didn't produce produce that could be gathered, but formal agriculture was not to be engaged in. And here's another hint. Then I will remember my covenant with Jacob, it says in verse 42. I will remember also my covenant with Isaac and also my covenant with Abraham, and I will remember the land. For the land shall be deserted by them and enjoy its Sabbath years by lying desolate without them. And so is there a strong sense in which the covenant agreement, that is a relationship between the living God and the people of Israel, includes the land as an active partner in that? Because it certainly seems the case that the land was meant to enjoy. The land had a responsibility to vomit out humans when they went wrong. So this has all sorts of resonances for, I think, an ethical Anthropocene, for taking a non-instrumentalist view, a non-scientific view, and a more biblical view that's amenable, as I said before, to post-colonial and indigenous ways of thinking about the non-human creation that is moving beyond the theological dualisms that seeing the earth as disposable, as well as the pragmatic dualisms of capitalism, or the methodological naturalism that simply reduces Earth system to something that you view through a computer model or under a microscope, or however it is you want to approach it. And we can see examples where, for example, in New Zealand now, a river has rights. There are countries that are starting to talk about the rights of creation and how we might relate to that. It's a big shift for white Western thinking, but this isn't just greenwash or paganism or whatever label you want to attach. This is my past 3 years of my life finding this right in our face in a text that Christians argue over how God made the world, and instead it's screaming at us loud and clear how we're meant to live with it and care for it. So I'm sure that will spawn some interesting points of discussion, which we'll come back to later once Claire has shared her perspectives on things. So thank you for your attendance.
Okay, excellent. For those of you whose heads are spinning, I don't have slides, I don't have big words, and the words I use will all be in English, so you can relax a little bit and sort of, I guess I'm going to ground some of that very high level thinking in my own story. I know there are people that maybe a couple of decades ago more so might have contrasted this need to pursue social justice, and I would certainly say that creation care and action on climate change fits in that justice space, but they might say, but evangelism might need to be the priority. Not only is that dualistic, my own story certainly says it can be both and, not either or. I didn't grow up in a churchy kind of home. I did sort of dip my toe in the water of church in and out, as my mother did the same thing, but I also have early memories of being taken to ashrams and watching my mum do yoga and light incense. So she was on her own search. I certainly grew up in a home where thrift was fairly commonplace, with my parents having learnt from their parents who had experienced wartime. So there was that frugality, I think, and we were immigrants. We came from South Africa and sort of had to do a reset financially, so we weren't flush with cash. I did spend a lot of time at a churchy school. I would have thought probably I was a Christian, but I look back to some of the questions that I was asking, even as late as sort of 17, 18, and certainly hadn't come to understand the fullness of the good news and the gospel and grace. I remember reflecting with friends saying, I can understand there's Hitler on one end and Mother Teresa on the other. How good do you have to be again? Which again just sort of showed a reasonably superficial, if not inaccurate, understanding of the Christian faith. one of my formative school memories is of sitting in year 8 geography class and learning about global warming from our geography teacher, who was obviously deeply passionate. So shout out to Mrs. Lynch. I think we even listened to a Sting song, and I was a Sting fan, his song Fragile. And so we looked at the fragility of the earth. We looked at population. I think I did an assignment where I compared different local government areas and what they were and weren't recycling at the time, which is fascinating to think that actually that's part of my core business, having ended up on council myself. So it's funny how these little things are in the mix. I think in grade 6, I also did an assignment. We had to interview someone about their work, and I interviewed the local mayor. So there you go. Maybe these little threads do all get woven together in a way that makes more sense as we age, but still mystifies us as time in our time. So I learned about global warming that, look, 30 years ago was urgent to some people. And that's one of those reminders to me. We keep talking about the critical decade. And I pointed out to someone the other day that I'm sure we've been talking about the critical decade for at least 13 or 14 years, which is worrying in itself. People might think we're at the beginning of the decade, but we're actually well through it. But I think that wake-up call in year 8 to reflect on the planet and some of the limitations, and then a trip to America in year 10, where my dad's work took him to Orlando in Florida quite often, and we went to NASA, to the space station. And there was a suggestion there that one of the reasons we're exploring space, and this is even in the mid-90s, was to see if there were other habitable planets and to help us deal with our resource constraints here. And I was only, 16, but I think even then there was something not quite right about that in terms of the logic of not actually paying sufficient attention to care for the earth we have, and instead, expensive exploration of space in the off chance that we might find a planet B. I remember reflecting too with some despondency on whether I would have children, and I didn't think I would, because I didn't know why anyone would bring children into an environment, a life on a planet like this. So it was actually part of that journey of seeking coherence and meaning and looking and longing for hope that fueled my spiritual search, that helped lead me to Jesus. I had a reasonably classic evangelical conversion at a Youth Alive rally, but was followed up with quite rigorous, serious discipleship. But unfortunately, in those sort of evangelical Pentecostal circles, it was that sort of classic dualism that says, oh, none of that matters now. It's all about going to heaven, plundering hell to populate heaven. I was sort of discipled out of some of those, almost intuitive burdens of care and concern for the planet, and also connecting the dots, going, isn't this about our survival and our thriving, not just our own, but others who are more vulnerable, or all of creation, flora and fauna. I think one of the other issues I was facing as a newer Christian, I was quite zealous in sharing my faith with family members and friends, but I wasn't finding much traction. It wasn't good news to them in the way that it was to me. And that's one of the reasons I decided to go to Bible college. I thought maybe more answers would help me. I probably ended up with many more questions through that journey, but I also had valuable opportunity to revisit some of these things. I did a subject called Biblical Ethics and the Person, and one of the questions we explored as a class was, we look back at things like slavery, or even how women have been treated in the past, and we sort of think, how did the church miss that? How did it get it so wrong? And how did they use scripture in support? And the question was posed, what might be our blind spots as we embark in not just a new century, but a new millennium? And I mentioned the environment, and particularly climate change. And then from there, actually wrote an essay. And I had that permission and that supportive environment to actually go back and study that, and to go, wow, this does matter. I believe it matters biblically. I believe it matters to God. I believe it matters for anyone who says they care about compassion and justice and loving their neighbour. From there, I went to work for a mission organisation with sort of mixed influences. There was probably more of that dualistic narrative that I was still sort of trying to get my head around. But I ended up meeting a couple whose son was very involved down in Frankston running his own energy efficiency business. He had grown up as a missionary, but hadn't really maintained his faith, but he'd maintained some of those aspects of justice. I ended up working for him, which again, just fueled my interest and provided, I guess, capacity through my work to be more attentive through my paid role to this thing, to these issues, and then ended up working as a carbon accountant. Following that was a season of raising children. And for those of you who are active in this space, it can be kind of a vexing journey, because you have children knowing that population is part of the puzzle, but children themselves are an act of hope, maybe defiant hope at times. But then for those who want to be hard at work to bring change, you can have moments where you feel your hands are tied and you're stuck at home, not just changing nappies, but washing cloth nappies, and not able to maybe engage in the way that you would. So that was an interesting season as well. But of course, you are driven to care more than you ever have before, because your children's life, and certainly your grandchildren's lives, might depend on the outcomes of some of the choices we make now. So I have a 9-year-old boy, and if he lives a good long life, he will be 88 at the turn of the century. So when we talk about these predictions about 2100, I can picture my son as an old man and can wonder what on earth his experience of life will be like, and whether or not human thriving will really be a possibility in the privileged and almost luxurious ways that we've known it. One of the, I guess, personal journeys that I went on, I guess, while having children, life was constrained, constricted. You feel like you're cutting corners everywhere and compromising as a Christian and as an activist and someone who says they care about the planet. I'd come home from the supermarket feeling a malaise, if not a depression, in terms of going, I'm trying to do the right thing, but I look at what is on the shelves at the supermarket and how trapped we are in a cycle and a system of the easy way out almost always being what's not so good for the planet, you know, to borrow Al Gore's phrase, inconvenient truth in so many areas of our lives, that I joined with some others and we started exploring the development of a co-housing community. So shared facilities, smaller households, smaller carbon footprints, sharing more, hopefully being less car dependent, maybe not only growing our own food, but maybe partnering with a local a local farm to purchase farm gate or organic. And again, sometimes these things are more expensive, but the goal was maybe as a collection of 8 households, we can do this together, and we don't all need lawnmowers, and we can have a laundry with good quality, white goods that will last a long life and that can be repaired. And again, it was multifaceted, but it was interesting in that the council officers of the day gave it the tick and said, this is great. And it needed to go to council because it was within a certain height limit where it just needed councillors to make the decision. But neighbours were suspicious that we might be a cult. They didn't like the visual bulk because we'd pushed it out to 3 stories, which is possible in Frankston. We'd seen plenty of others, but hadn't thought to ask whether or not they all ended up at VCAT, and it turns out they did. But there were 2 particular comments from councillors during this time. One was a councillor who cynically said, I don't understand how you think you're going to force people to share things. I thought, wow, across time, culture, place, civilization, culture, language, sharing is how households cope. It's how communities prosper. It was the sort of lack of progressive, not even progressive, the lack of sense in that statement and the individualism that it betrayed was quite shocking. And another councillor who had more of a background in property, she said, I look at these plans and think you're trying to build rooming houses and call them something else. So again, thinking that we were going to overcharge people for substandard accommodation, which was strange as well, because we planned solar panels and provision for batteries and rammed earth and a shared orchard and shared veggies. And I thought I'd made it really clear that this is where I wanted to raise my children, in community, in village, living more simply. And there was just no capacity for the councillors of the day, which was only about 6 years ago, to connect and understand it all. which is why in 2020, when a friend challenged me and said, I really think you should run, I sort of thought there's probably some room for improvement, to be honest. So mention was made earlier of the, I put forward a notice of motion. So we've got a 20-year urban tree canopy strategy. And I said, what's the point of having a plan to plant trees in 20 years' time? To me, that makes no sense. Money's cheap. We might have the money. Wouldn't you bring that forward? So in 20 years' time, neighbourhoods are enjoying the benefit of, carbon sequestration and shade and enhanced property values. So the starting point was to say, can we at least double the tree planting in the next 4 years? So that's one of the things I've been able to do. And that's where protecting trees and planning decisions around trees and tree canopy, that's one of the key levers that we do have at a local government level. The other one is waste, and we've got some very difficult decisions to make moving forward in the next few years. So landfill sites are associated with very significant climate emissions. The site that we're using will have to close in the next few years because it will be full. So some of the options on the table are advanced waste processing, waste to energy, so very advanced incineration. And other people say, I can't believe that in the year 2022, we're thinking about using the atmosphere as a dump for our burnt waste. But some of the other options might involve trucking our waste an extra 70 k's north of our city, which is potentially 130, 40 k return trip. And until we have electric trucks and a supercharged grid to charge these vehicles, there's emissions implications there. So these are some of the things that I'm able to sit with and speak into as well. And then there's design and planning laws, and we're seeing those conversations happen now after the floods. I know someone in New South Wales who's had an involvement on local government. He said, people need to call it. We might need to move Lismore. What does that look like to move cities, towns, households, homes? What does it mean to be increasingly aware that we might have planning provisions that says, sure, you can build on that salvage swamp or near those wetlands, and we might need to rethink that. And there's going to be significant social costs to that in terms of the value of housing. And there's also going to be very significant implications for people who find their properties are literally uninsurable. So that's a very quick scamper through my own journey, which really has seen me come to faith through my big questions about the planet, the why and the who and the how of my life here on earth, what it looks like, what I'm called to, what faithful discipleship might look like. I know there's debates that rage in terms of how involved even in civic engagement Christians should be. Should we throw ourselves in? Should we set ourselves apart? But I guess my journey of discipleship, and particularly what it looks like to try and protect or enhance or preserve or expand sacred space and to care for neighbours, has brought me to this place. So there's not necessarily very direct connect with the words and theories and concepts Mick was using at a really high level, but hopefully that fleshes out for you that this stuff is not just academic. It makes the world of difference. So thanks for listening to me.
Thank you so much, Claire. Well, we've had a whirlwind tour from the theological heights of Mick to the how do you put it into practice of Claire, and I've enjoyed both of them. Claire, I'm sorry, but perhaps it's because Mick went first, or perhaps it's a reflection on the audience. But if we're going to take the questions as they came, they're almost all directed at Mick. So I think probably people have lots of questions for you too. But given that we've only got 15 minutes left and we try and stick to time, I'll tell you what I'm going to do. Instead of asking people to speak their own questions, I'm going to read the questions. Again, a question to you, Mick. What iniquity do you think had the land committed to be punished for in Leviticus 24?
Oh, wow. I mean, it's somehow in the Levitical thinking, iniquity or impurity or uncleanness was something that could be transferred between, material and immaterial objects. So it was it's interesting. I didn't want to go there, but it was human sexual relationships. But the whole of Leviticus, Holiness Code talks about binaries, which we don't worry about anymore. So most people wear polyester cotton these days or eat Caesar salads and don't worry, but we're still hung up on sexual relationships. But in that context, it was human sexual relationships that, and somehow the writer sees that as polluting the land, and the direct consequence of that is the land vomiting them out. In the modern period, of course, it's the way in which we run our societies. We treat each other and we treat the non-human creation.
Mm-hmm. Leviticus 24 is a list of things that the people must not do wrong, isn't it? And then it gets to this. Thanks, Mick. Carolyn asks, how do we think of land resting when desolate, when it also takes energy to produce weeds? I'm not sure if that's a theological or a thermodynamic question.
That's a really good question. I think rest is primarily from human agricultural activity in that context. It seems to be what it is. Humans you could still go into the fields and take things. You just couldn't tend the vines, or, you know, these days you'd say you wouldn't run the combine harvester, but if the grain set seed, you could pick the seeds, etc. So it's not a cessation of natural process, but it's more a rest from human activity and letting, I suppose, God's divine provision through the natural processes to keep going.
Thanks, Mick. Jules in Time has made a comment, which everybody can read in the chat there. Richard says, linguistically and theologically, is there a relation between the finishing of God's work of creation in Genesis 2:1 and 2 and the finishing of Jesus' work on the cross, John 19:30? And if so, how might this in turn relate to our stewardship of creation, with what I suspect is a Maori word for stewardship in there, which I won't try and pronounce?
There are 7 signs in John corresponding to 7 days of creation. Genesis 1 is very clearly echoed in John 1, and Genesis 2 is very clearly echoed in John 20. First day of the week, before the sun had come up, Jesus is in a garden, mistaken to be a gardener. And instead of the two clinging to each other, Mary's told, don't cling to me. So there's all those deliberate echoes. So it's definitely that's a new creation, and it's renewal of human responsibilities at the beginning of the repair of relationships between humans and God, humans and each other, and humans and the non-human creation, a la the curses of Genesis 3. How's that for a tight answer? Yeah.
That's a very tight answer.
So in other words, what I'm saying is I think it's a renewal of the entire of humans' vocation, and that includes agriculture, creation, care, all those aspects of what it means to be human and embodied, because it's a bodily resurrection, an empty tomb.
Yep. Great. Thanks, Mick. Dave Hooker, thank you, Mick. Both Deuteronomic theology and the judgment oracles of the prophets speak strongly about how creation disintegrates when people live outside the covenant. Would you consider that to be a way to understand Paul in Romans 8:28 when he writes of the groaning of creation?
Yeah, I think that's fair. And in fact, that goes all the way back to even Romans 1. You know, Paul calls the creation as covenant partners, as witnesses to the covenant and the breaking thereof. So, you know, natural theology then is intimately tied up with a theology of sin and fallenness. So, yeah, I think that's fair.
Richard Milne says, should the concept of stewardship be replaced with perhaps partnership? How does this relate to the Gaia hypothesis and also to Maori understandings, I guess, but somebody will have to translate that for me.
Yeah, I don't know anything about Maori understandings. I'm just slowly unpacking what Aboriginal Christian thoughts on this would be. I suspect so. You might argue, like the earlier church, the church fathers argue for the Pope as the first among equals, that maybe human beings are the first among equals, because very clearly we're given a mandate that's different to that of creation. And we are the ones who engage as conscious actors in all of this. We make the choices that Claire talked about very consciously, or don't, but we don't have it. We're without excuse, which is precisely what Paul says. So partnership, yes, acknowledging when you really start to dig into thinking about, well, where does consciousness come from and how we tie to the rest of creation, how does it emerge? A whole bunch of huge theological issues. I'm waffling at this point. Yes, I do. And yes, I think it does relate to Gaia hypothesis in that manner. But let's not totally erode human uniqueness. I'm not trying to do that. But I'm just saying we share the earth with a whole bunch of other actors we have to work with.
If we have time, I've got a question about that too, about the agency of the land. But it's not my turn yet. Robin Fry asks, aren't weeds just pioneer plants, just filling in bare spaces or seen by humans as plants in the wrong place? Weeds try to recover the bare ground.
Well, that's certainly the case. I'm just trying to think where it is now. It's in Genesis 2, where I might be wrong now, where there's this clear delineation between the different sorts of plants and those for human agriculture and those that are wild, which you'd call weed in a different context, and God provides rain for them both. In fact, God provides the rain to water the wild plants and rain for the formation of the human beings that tend in agriculture, the domesticated plants. So that's certainly the case. But, for human needs in existence, we invite weeds in where they shouldn't be for our purposes, when we go wrong in a relationship with the non-human.
I must say my relationship with my wife is partly defined by the definition of weeds, and I try and work it out, but we go out into the garden, and when Lindy describes a tree as a weed tree, what she means is, I'd like you to cut that one down. And I'm not sure there's any more sort of ontological nature of the tree, except that, anyway, it gets described as a weed tree and I cut it down. Claire, oh, right, okay. So Claire's given us some details there about how we can contact her. She's alerted us to the fact that she has 2 surnames. The one on the book is Dawson. The current one is Harvey. So it is one and the same person. Now, we have been remarkably efficient with these questions. Thank you, Mick. You've answered it extremely succinctly. So I thought we were going to have to rush through, and we have rushed through, but now we've got a few minutes left. Let me ask my question, and other people who've got a question might want to just put their hands up. You can go down to reactions down the bottom of the page, and one of your options is to raise your hand if you've got a question. It would be great for somebody to ask Claire a question because, she said a lot of fascinating things. Carolyn's clapping her hands. My question is, sometimes in this conversation about the land vomiting and all that sort of thing, what sounds like figures of speech can sound like we're actually giving the land agency, and that's, I guess, also where the Gaia hypothesis comes in. The land having rights, isn't that a figure of speech to say humans have responsibilities to God to care for the land, or am I missing something?
Oh, I mean, this is the eternal question of the fact that the Bible's written by humans to humans to tell them what they should be doing, and we have a doctrine of inspiration of one way, shape, or form that says, okay, God's involved in that conversation, shaping it. But at one at the same time, because the creation itself doesn't have a voice or can't receive the written word, I don't think that means that this isn't written either to make us think about the agency and the rights and responsibilities of the non-human. It's just that it's full of instructions on what we should do, but then we're almost given a small snippet into the conversation, however that might occur, between God and the non-human. Does that make sense? So I mean, if I either read in the Bible what God wants me to do, or I have a vision or hear in my head and I evaluate that, because I am a verbal creature. We have language, both written and spoken. All sorts of other creatures have languages or understanding, and the non-human, the abiotic part of the earth system doesn't. But I guess it depends upon what model of consciousness you like. I've been starting to dabble a bit in panpsychism that says that agency of consciousness is embedded in the very fabric of creation. It gives a wonderful kind of understanding where it appears. I know materialists use that to get around the God question altogether, but for a Christian, it's kind of enticing to think that both consciousness, and I think to even the wood wide web, for those who've been reading about the fungal connections in the forest, that even altruism is very embedded into the very nature of creation itself, beyond the human into the non-human, and maybe even to the what we'd call non-conscious. So I just find that, you know, it's a different kind of ontology to the one that we're used to in the West, and it certainly wouldn't be a stranger to Aboriginal Christians who would say, yes, our basic beliefs are fundamentally animistic, and they'll look at Scripture and say, oh, look, there it is again, and you white Christians have totally missed it. So,
okay, a few people here will be sort of wiggling in their seats at that
Sure.
sort of language about possibly interpreting Christian theology as animistic, wouldn't they?
well, I mean, you don't necessarily have to use the word, and it might not carry the same strength or force or so on, but I'm not talking about ancestor worship. I'm not talking about, again, flattening things. But if it's the case that we've overlooked that God has imbued the rest of creation in a way analogous to us, but not at quite the same level, you know, this is the challenge I think that we need. Otherwise, we're going to, what does white Western Christianity do? It falls back into modernism. It falls back into Enlightenment view. It falls back into the kind of dualisms that, you know, the likes of Tom Wright and others are starting to challenge, or have been challenging for a number of years. We need the challenge, even if it's, you know, they are just figures of speech, and this is a guide for our behavior. It means our behavior needs to be quite different to what it's been in the past. But I think it's a little bit more than that.
So I'll just push this a little bit further, and then we'll go to you, Carolyn. So are you challenging or exploring the possibility of challenging a dualism between life and non-life? Seeing rather a spectrum, the possibility of a spectrum with no sharp divide between life and non-life?
Oh, that's a difficult one, isn't it? I'm not qualified to,
I'm just wondering
to say that categorically. And that's certainly what, I think that's what panpsychism hints at. But, you know, maybe it's some kind of spectrum. There is, I suppose, if you adopt concepts of emergence, then at some point you can say, okay, well, things are now different because something new has emerged, and that's life from non-life. But, you know, at the very least, if we remember, those who've been around for a long time, George Ellis, when he was in Australia, talking about what bees can do with a few neurons. If you know about bee wiggles and dances and so on. And again, the discovering the cognition that goes on in plants and in forest systems, that we need to stretch our categories a little harder than we have done in the past. And if that's all this talk does, is stretch us theologically a little bit more to give a broader framework for ultimately sitting in the kind of everyday living that Claire talked about, which is precisely what Leviticus was all about. Everyday life in the covenant, in a land that God had given them, and the relationships that existed, then I've done what I set out to do tonight.
Thanks, Mick. We're at time, but I want to give Carolyn a go because I promised it and then I hogged the time. Go ahead, Carolyn.
I just wanted to ask Mick to define what he meant by the land resting, please.
Okay. So as I might have said earlier, I'm not sure, it's fundamentally in this context from human agriculture, from human beings extracting value from the land and modifying and changing it, so tilling the soil, etc. As I say, in Leviticus, there was the possibility, the ability to go and to gather food, but you weren't meant to engage in agriculture. So the land was meant to renew itself. And it's just worth as a side note that a lot of work has been done, is that in itself wouldn't have been enough to restore the land in a pre-fertilizer age. So there was a system of fallowing that would have had to have gone on underneath that, but that you know, Sabbath year and then Jubilee year reset was a real total reset of the entire of human relationships in Israel, including that with the land.
Is there some element of saving of energy by not having to produce crops? Is that in your mind?
Yes, so. I mean, it does require a surplus to be produced from the previous year. So you actually need to invest. I'm not talking about kind of, what am I not talking about? I'm trying to reach for the words here that, you know, is that the kind of some Christian traditions, it's just let go and trust God type thing. It's not about not making provision for the future, but it's, you know, consciously remembering that God in the process of creation rested and that we're to model our behavior on that. So yeah, energy conservation will be a part of that.
Thanks, Mick. Carolyn, I'll give you a last short word. Go.
All right, go ahead. Well, if you look at any natural environment, it takes just as much energy to produce natural vegetation as it does to produce a crop, which is why I'm puzzled over the idea of resting by refusing to take a crop.
I mean, I guess at this point, then there's a distinction between human, simply on the level of human engagement. So it's the difference between letting processes go as they are and a deliberate human engagement or involvement in that agricultural act, and the act of trusting upon divine provision, which is the surplus that you produced the previous year, plus whatever you can glean, is the word I was looking for earlier, gleaning from it. I'm not necessarily suggesting this is going to be a one-to-one way in which we can apply the principle to today, but we do need to think about what it means to give the creation rest from the ceaseless march of progress and manufacture and whatever. Yeah. I'll leave the details to others.
Thanks, Mick.
I certainly agree with that. Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, Carolyn. Graham, you have a question?
If I'm allowed to say thank you both very much indeed. Mick, fascinating, and I don't want to take issue with any of it. I think, though, that Chris was right to push you on the question of where this goes and what sort of connections you want to make with various alternative worldviews. And I just utter the cautionary note that I think we need to be making distinctions in every direction. And I think that's one of our Christian responsibilities, not lining up holus bolus with any of these alternative views of the world, making connections by all means, but making distinctions too. And that's why this sort of thinking and theological thinking is always hard work. Just on the point at the end about resting the land, I speak completely ignorantly, but I've always been interested in the connection between that idea and the old farming practice of letting paddocks lie fallow for, say, a year and 3, which I take it has been a lot to do with the recognition that nutrients that crops require tend to be replenished if the crops aren't drawing those nutrients from the soil every so often, but can be replenished by weeds and other things. Anyway, that you can speak more with proper competence about that. The last thing, and you may not want to say anything about this tonight, but I have in mind the kind of Christian voice which would say, yeah, all very interesting as an indication of Old Testament stuff, and all credit to you for teasing out what's going on. But really it's irrelevant to us because, we're in the new kingdom that's coming. It's quite clear that this world is passing away. We've got to be concerned with the new kingdom and what lies ahead. And people who might want to add a little bit of theological sophistication to that might refer to things like the fact that Jesus says in a radical way, my Father is still working and I am working too. So from which somebody might like to say, well, the old idea of Sabbath is for the past. It's a new thing. And so really, Mick, thanks very much, but none of this is relevant to our duties now. Now, I don't believe that, but I'm interested to know how you contend with it, because it's whether it's spelled out or just implicit. I think it's in too much Christian thinking. Anyway, you may not want to say anything about that.
No, I don't mind touching upon that briefly. Firstly, point taken that, and I tried to make that point earlier, and certainly in terms of violence and labour, there's a sharp contrast between the Genesis creation account and numeralish, and so we need to continue to maintain the differences. It just seems to me that our own white, I keep saying this, I know, but I know too many Aboriginal Christians now tonight, white Western Christians have moved past at least, or too ready to dismiss certain metaphors as being merely that. And how far we push it, and what are the kind of metaphysical models you adopt, be it panpsychism or whatever else, to accommodate these things they're models that you try and push. I go back to Ron Chung's theological safe space, and that's what I thought tonight would be. So it's like, let's pursue some ideas, and I've never been afraid to shoot my mouth off and suffer the consequences. But in terms of what you were saying, someone rightly asked about John, and I think John's gospel is where we, if you'll forgive the pun, really ground this thinking again. And it only struck me a few months ago, 7 signs to correspond to the 7 agricultural festivals, which also tied to Israel's salvation history, which ties back to the 7 days of creation, etc., leading from Genesis 1 to Genesis 2 and John 1, John 20. So a recapitulation of that. And I think, as I said at the time, the emphasis on the bodily resurrection to combat the, the Gnosticism, the dualism that infects a lot of Western Christianity. I'm told it's not so much a problem in the East and in the Eastern Orthodox tradition. So that's your path forward, is resurrection. And when you do that, and you look at the eschatological vision of Revelation 21 in particular, which, by the way, is largely but not entirely preterist. Most of it is really talking about now and what God is doing now and how God is renewing creation now. So just a plug, I wrote a book called All Things New, God's Plan to Renew Our World, and it really does emphasize that that's mostly now. But yeah, that's thinking that we do have to combat. But it's how do we, and I saw this as a discussion or a debate on Twitter the other day, as you do, is that I did a master's where I tried to read Genesis through Hebrew eyes and in a Jewish fashion, but at the end, as Christians, we have to read it through the lens of Christ. And so it's the fulfillment of all that the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament was talking about, and the ultimate fulfillment in the eschaton. So you need to draw all those connections all the way through, and the language of the Old Testament through Revelation, for example, or as I said, the festivals in John. So right, the work can be done. But I did a master's with a Hebrew Bible scholar.
Sure.
And so that's the shape that it took. But I was just fascinated with going back and the things that emerged as a direct result.
Yeah. Thank you.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Charles?
Oh, sorry.
Got it?
Yep, I'm there.
Loud and clear.
Yeah, no, thank you for raising some new ideas, particularly about the being of the creation, which is why I asked about the idea that the creation has committed iniquity. I understand that the land, you might say, the sins of the people was visited on the land, in the same way sins of parents are visited on children.
Mm.
But your translation implied that the land had actually sinned and therefore it needed to be punished. And that's why I was asking you, has the land committed sin rather than having the humans' sin being visited on it?
Look, I'm
any thoughts on that?
Yeah. And that's a really good question. And there's a lot I didn't dig into when thinking about that, in how uncleanness is something that's transmitted. And you see that obsession in Second Temple Judaism and in the Gospels about all the bars they found in Jerusalem for washing beds and clothes and so on, where uncleanness can be transferred. And there's less of a distinction in Leviticus between moral transgressions and ritual ones. So what's immoral about an emission of blood, whether you've bled or it's the menstrual cycle, whatever? So cleanness and uncleanness. So I think it isn't, I can't say categorically because it's not something I focused on a lot, but it isn't the land in itself sinning, but it's the uncleanness and the iniquity of human beings being transferred to the land, and it's suggesting some kind of dynamic relationship. Now, whether or not there's the land should have done X in response, ultimately the land does do X, and that's the vomiting out of the nations. But I'd kind of resist any understanding that says the non-human creation, to use an Augustinian term, is fallen, in the sense that human beings are or may be. That to go to Polkinghorne, free will might lead you to rejecting God, but free process doesn't. And that maybe comes back to the limits on the agency or cognizance of non-humans. That's probably very vague, but I haven't thought that out in depth. So,
Graham, you've got another comment. Oh, and there's some things popping up in the chat as well, folks. So look there too. Go ahead, Graham.
Look, I'm sorry, I don't want to hog anything. I just realised that There's something you said, Mick, in answering me that I want to respond to. You said that you'd chosen, because this was a theologically safe space, to be trying out these things.
Yeah.
The last thing I would want to do is discourage
No, not at all.
or anyone else from doing that. I think that's exactly one of the best things that these sorts of meetings can do. Namely, we help one another try out our thinking in ways, as part of a critical but loving community, working out where our theology should take us. So the last thing I want to do is discourage any of that. I will now shut up.
No, that's fine. And I didn't take it as that. It's just a helpful caution. And it is, of course, at the end, I've gone at what's the dropping off point off the text. That's the next step into the following these threads. Yeah.
And having mentioned a theological safe space twice, I must remind everybody that ISCAST's third value is an academic and theological safe space. And that's why we can have the conversations that we're having tonight, even though we may not all agree with each other. We want there to be a space where we can have these sincere conversations.
Yeah.
So thank you, Graham and Mick, for pointing to ISCAST's third value.
Interesting comment there from Richard, that there's the understanding from a Māori perspective where human transgression affects the well-being of the land. I won't attempt to mangle that whenua. Again, it's there in Indigenous thought. The Israelites were Indigenous. Well, no, were they Indigenous to the land? It depends on how much you accept the idea of the Exodus. But the point is that they lived there. They were embedded in the land and the practices, and it's that embeddedness, I think, Claire's really hinting about, isn't it? It's the time to slow down and be embedded in community with each other and in the broader community, where Levitical type practices actually make most sense.
Thank you all for coming. Thank you all for staying. And do tell your friends about the series, and we look forward to seeing you again.
Yeah. Thanks again, Mick and Claire.
Thank you.
Thank you again. Yeah. Let me say thank you so much to Mick and to Claire for a power-packed theological and practical thinking session on these issues. I think that Nicola is going to close our meeting with prayer.
So let us pray. Loving God, creator of the universe, even as our hearts are heavy with the troubles of the world, climate change and war and pandemic, we are grateful for gatherings like this in your name, time out of time to reflect on your creation and its depth and brilliance. We thank you for all we have learned and reflected on tonight. We give thanks for Claire and Mick and their wisdom. Give us courage to find new ways to share and new steps to counter climate change. Send us into the night with new insights to ponder, and protect us and the world from evil. In the name of Jesus, amen.